12 unmanned surface vessels, 0 crew. Combined payload, enough shaped explosive to gut a tanker's engine room and send 80,000 tons of sanctioned crude to the bottom of the Black Sea. The operators were already at their stations when the satellite window opened. This is the story of how Ukraine took the war to Russia's shadow fleet. Not at the port, not at the pipeline, not in the boardrooms where sanctions lawyers argue over paperwork. At sea, in the dark, against a moving target with armed escorts running interference. And how, in 93 minutes, the economics of Russia's war funding changed. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight we're breaking down one of the most audacious naval drone operations of the entire conflict. A coordinated strike on a sanctioned Shadow Fleet tanker operating under a third country flag, running crude out of Novorossiysk past Western price caps and straight into the Kremlin's war chest. Western intelligence had known the vessel's name for months. Satellite imagery had tracked it across 14 voyages. Analysts logged its loading schedules, escort patterns, and predictable routes through the eastern Black Sea corridor. It operated under a Gabon-flagged registration, crewed by nationals from 3 countries, owned through a shell company chain running from Cyprus through the UAE to a Hong Kong address shared with 47 other firms. On paper, it was a commercial crude carrier. In practice, it was a floating revenue engine for a war machine that had been bombing Ukrainian cities for years. Billions of dollars in oil had moved through its holds. Every voyage contributed to Russian military payroll, ammunition production, and procurement of Iranian drone components that would later fall on Odessa and Kherson. Ukraine had been watching, and Ukraine had decided that watching was over. The operation did not begin at the waterline. It began 3 months earlier, in a signals intelligence cell tracking the Shadow Fleet's communication patterns across the Black Sea. Ukrainian SIGINT operators, working alongside partner intelligence services whose identities remain classified, had identified a recurring anomaly in the vessel's AIS transponder behavior. The ship was going dark at predictable intervals. 60 to 90 minutes before each loading operation, the AIS signal would drop. The crew believed this made them harder to track. It made them easier to time. The Shadow Fleet tanker was not alone. That was the first operational challenge. Russian naval escort doctrine for high-value commercial vessels in the Black Sea had evolved significantly since the destruction of the flagship Moskva. What had once been cursory patrol coverage had hardened into layered protection. A pair of fast patrol boats running 2 to 4 kilometers ahead of the target, a Ka-27 helicopter on rotating alert from a coastal base near Anapa, and coastal defense radar coverage from at least 2 Monolith B targeting stations along the Taman Peninsula. Getting 12 autonomous surface vessels through that cordon without triggering a response before the primary target was reached, that was the problem Ukrainian naval warfare teams spent 11 weeks solving. Which weapon system threatened the operation most? The helicopter or the patrol boats? Comment your analysis below. The answer changes the entire tactical picture. The solution came in 2 parts. First, timing. The helicopter rotation pattern had a 14-minute gap between handoffs. The window when the outbound aircraft was returning to base and the inbound hadn't reached its patrol station yet. Ukrainian planners had documented this gap across 9 separate observation windows. It was consistent. It was exploitable. Second, decoys. 4 of the 12 vessels in the strike package carried no explosive payload. Instead, they carried electronic signature emitters designed to mimic the radar cross-section of a full-size naval drone swarm. Louder, faster, more aggressive on radar than the real attack units. These 4 decoys would trigger the patrol boat response and draw the Monolith B radar systems into active tracking mode, presenting themselves as the primary threat while the 8 actual strike platforms ran dark beneath the radar horizon on a different bearing. It was a 3-dimensional deception. And it required the decoy operators to knowingly sacrifice their platforms to give the strike units a window. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this operation will destroy the logic of how Russia thought it had protected its Shadow Fleet. The vessels launched from a position Ukrainian authorities have not disclosed. What is known from post-operation analysis and the accounts of officials who have spoken on background is that the strike package was pre-staged in shallow coastal waters south of the Ukrainian-held coastline, concealed within commercial fishing vessel patterns that had been normalized over the preceding 6 weeks. The Russians had cataloged those patterns as non-threatening. That assessment didn't change when 12 new contacts appeared among them, because the operational security around the staging had been meticulous. Launch window, a period of moderate sea state, Beaufort scale 3, with wave heights between 0.5 meter and 1 meter. Enough chop to degrade optical observation from helicopter altitude. Not enough to compromise the stability of the unmanned surface vessels, which had been tested in sea states up to Beaufort 5 during development trials. The lead elements of the strike package crossed the maritime demarcation at 1:47 a.m. 12 vessels. 4 decoys running at 32 knots on a northeastern bearing, making maximum noise. 8 strike platforms running at 19 knots on a southeastern bearing, below the radar floor, using terrain masking from a shallow shoal formation that Ukrainian maritime planners had identified as a natural dead zone in the Monolat B coverage pattern. The patrol boats reacted to the decoys in 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Both vessels turned to intercept at maximum speed. Their onboard radar was painting 4 fast-moving contacts approaching on a bearing that suggested a direct attack run on the port facilities at Kavkaz, not on the tanker. The escort crews made a reasonable tactical decision based on the information available to them. They were wrong. The Ka-27 helicopter scrambled from Anapa at 1:53 a.m. The crew was working under the assumption that the decoys were the primary threat. They flew northeast. The 8 strike platforms were already 17 kilometers to the southeast, running in 2 columns of 4, maintaining radio silence, navigating by preloaded GPS waypoints cross-checked against inertial reference systems that couldn't be jammed. Here's where the first obstacle appeared. At 2:04 a.m., one of the 8 strike platforms developed a propulsion fault. The right side motor controller threw a thermal error at the exact moment the unit crossed into rougher water near the shoal edge. The platform dropped to half speed. It was falling behind. And because the operation required all 8 strike units to arrive within a 45-second window to overwhelm the tanker's close-in defensive systems simultaneously, a slow unit was nearly as dangerous as a dead one. The operator team had rehearsed this scenario. The stricken vessel was remotely commanded to a holding pattern 3 kilometers off the tanker's projected track. It would wait. If the primary strike succeeded, the operator would direct the unit to a secondary target. One of the patrol boats, now fully committed to chasing decoys 6 kilometers away. If the strike failed and the holding vessel was the only live platform remaining, the operator would face a different calculation. 7 strike platforms continued inbound. The operation timeline held. The Shadow Fleet tanker was running at 12 knots on a southeasterly heading, loaded with approximately 60,000 metric tons of crude oil. It had no dedicated naval crew. The sailors aboard were merchant mariners. Professionals, but not combat trained. The vessel carried 1 fixed machine gun mount on the bridge wing, standard for vessels operating in the Black Sea since the start of the full-scale conflict, and a crew of 23. At 2:11 a.m., the vessel's radar operator picked up what appeared to be a low observable surface contact at a range of approximately 8 kilometers. The contact was faint. It could have been a wave return. Standard procedure would have been to alert the escort. The escort was not answering on the primary frequency. They were 6 kilometers northeast, actively engaged in chasing decoy platforms and firing their deck guns at targets built to absorb that fire and keep transmitting. The radar operator on the tanker made a second call on the backup frequency. He got through. The escort boats relayed the contact bearing. But by the time the message was processed and a decision made to reorient at least 1 patrol boat toward the tanker's position, the 7 incoming strike platforms were at 4 kilometers and accelerating to their terminal attack speed of 38 knots. How many vessels successfully reached the tanker? A 5B6C7? The answer comes at the end. Keep watching. The tanker's captain ordered hard to port, a reasonable response to a radar contact on his starboard quarter. Also, the wrong response tactically, because the Ukrainian strike package had been programmed for exactly that maneuver. The preloaded attack geometry accounted for the vessel's turning radius and maximum rudder response time. The waypoints adjusted automatically. At 2:14 a.m., the first 2 strike platforms impacted the tanker on its starboard side aft in the region of the engine room and aft fuel bunkers. The detonations were visible from the Ukrainian-held coastline, not because the coastline was close. It was not. They were visible because each platform carried between 150 and 200 kilograms of explosive charge, and the secondary ignition of the tanker's own fuel systems amplified the initial blast into a fireball that satellite imaging would later capture rising to an altitude of over 300 meters. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what happened next on that tanker was not an end. It was a complication. The vessel did not sink immediately. Tankers do not sink easily. A modern crude carrier is subdivided into multiple cargo tanks and ballast compartments specifically to resist catastrophic flooding from a single hull breach. The designers of these vessels never anticipated that the threat would come in the form of 7 autonomous surface drones arriving in sequence over 90 seconds. The 3rd and 4th platforms impacted amidships, targeting the manifold area where cargo loading and discharge equipment was located. The fifth platform struck the bow section, forward of the forecastle, in a calculated attempt to induce flooding in the forward void tanks and increase the vessel's trim, making it harder to control and accelerating the overall loss of seakeeping. The sixth platform had a guidance anomaly in the final 200 meters of its approach. It veered 14 degrees from its programmed track and impacted the port side rather than the starboard. The operators watching the telemetry marked it as a partial success. The detonation was in the correct longitudinal zone but on the wrong beam. Damage assessment would later determine that this impact was actually the most destructive of the sequence, because it struck at a frame junction where the hull was structurally weaker and created a breach extending through two adjacent cargo tanks. The seventh platform made it to 200 meters before the tanker's machine gun destroyed it. One crew member on the bridge wing had managed to acquire the incoming contact visually in the firelight from the previous detonations and engage the weapon mount. Remarkable marksmanship under extraordinary pressure. Also too late. If you believe tactics win wars, type Ukraine radar in the comments. 6 detonations. One partial miss that turned into a kill. And the seventh platform destroyed, but functionally irrelevant because the primary target was already dying. The tanker began listing to port at 2:18 a.m. The list was initially 4 degrees. Over the following 22 minutes, as flooding progressed through the breached compartments, it increased to 17 degrees. At that angle, cargo operations become impossible, damage control becomes extremely difficult, and the crew faces a genuine choice: stay aboard and try to save the vessel, or abandon ship. The crew chose survival. 23 merchant mariners went into the water, or into lifeboats between 2:31 and 2:39 a.m. The captain was last to leave the bridge. He activated the vessel's distress beacon as he departed. The escort boats reached the tanker's position at 2:44 a.m. By that time, the vessel was listing at 23 degrees and settling by the stern. The patrol boat crews recovered the merchant mariners from the water. All 23 survived. The tanker's captain was among the last recovered. The vessel sank at 3:22 a.m. Final position confirmed by Ukrainian General Staff post-operation analysis. Approximately 64 nautical miles from the nearest Ukrainian-held coastline. International waters. The Ka-27 helicopter arrived on scene at 3:17 a.m., 5 minutes before the vessel went under. The crew filmed the sinking. That footage, captured on the helicopter's onboard systems, was recovered by Russian naval authorities and has not been publicly released. Ukrainian intelligence sources indicate the footage shows the tanker's final moments in detail, a 60,000-ton vessel rolling onto its port side and sliding beneath the surface over approximately 4 minutes. Now, for the question that changes the strategic calculus entirely, what happens to Moscow's shadow fleet when tanker captains realize escort protection cannot guarantee their survival? The stricken platform held in reserve, the one with the propulsion fault, was directed to intercept one of the patrol boats as it returned from the rescue operation. The operator lined up the approach. The motor controller error had partially resolved. The platform was running at reduced speed but controllable. At 3:44 a.m., the operator committed to the attack run. The patrol boat's crew detected the incoming contact at approximately 300 meters. They opened fire with their deck weapon. They hit the platform at 140 meters. The detonation occurred close enough to the patrol boat's stern to cause significant damage to its propulsion section. The vessel was disabled. A second patrol boat took it under tow. By 4 a.m., the operation was over. Both patrol boats were either damaged or committed to recovery operations. The Ka-27 had departed the area. The decoy platforms had been spent, 3 destroyed by gunfire, 1 flooded through self-destruct after mission completion. The 7 strike platforms that had engaged the tanker were gone, consumed in their own detonations or sunk by secondary explosions from the target. Total Ukrainian naval drone losses: 11 platforms. 1 held in reserve, damaged but recovered. Total cost. Ukrainian sources indicate the entire strike package represented an investment of approximately $3 to $4 million in hardware. The vessel they sank was carrying crude oil worth, at market prices at the time of the strike, approximately $38 to $42 million. The vessel itself represented a replacement cost of $60 to $70 million for a tanker of that class and age. The insurance claim. If any insurer was willing to cover shadow fleet operations, was a legal fiction given the sanctions violations involved. But the financial calculus goes beyond the single vessel. What would NATO maritime planners have done differently with the escort doctrine? Comment your tactical analysis below. Satellite imagery analysis conducted by open-source intelligence researchers in the days following the operation identified 8 other tankers operating similar shadow fleet routes in the Black Sea. Within 72 hours of the strike becoming public, through a combination of distress, beacon activation, Coast Guard reports, and Ukrainian military official statements. 5 of those 8 vessels had altered their routes. 2 had made port at Novorossiysk and not departed. 1 had gone dark on AIS entirely, which paradoxically made it more visible to military surveillance radar rather than less. The Shadow Fleet's operational tempo in the eastern Black Sea dropped by an estimated 60 to 70% in the weeks following the operation. Russian oil revenues, already under pressure from Western sanctions enforcement and the G7 price cap mechanism, took a measurable hit. Not catastrophic, not war-ending, but real and ongoing. What the Kremlin had built was a parallel logistics system designed to be deniable, flexible, and distributed enough to absorb individual vessel losses. What the Ukrainian strike demonstrated was that deniability works both ways. If Russia could run oil through ghost tankers with no accountability, Ukraine could sink ghost tankers with no formal attribution requirement either. The operation was claimed by Ukrainian military intelligence through indirect channels. No formal statement, no named commander. Just satellite imagery of wreckage, a distress beacon log, and a merchant crew telling their story to maritime safety investigators. The Russian response was to accelerate the hardening of Shadow Fleet escort protocols. Intelligence assessments from the period indicate Moscow ordered a doubling of patrol boat coverage for high-value commercial vessels, the addition of dedicated aerial surveillance using Orlan 10 drones in maritime patrol configuration, and the installation of additional short-range radar systems at key points along the Taman Peninsula approach corridor. All of that cost money. All of that diverted assets. All of that was a direct operational tax on a logistics system that Russia needed to function efficiently to sustain its war economy. There is something worth sitting with here. The operators who ran this mission were not naval officers in the traditional sense. They were engineers, technicians, and warfare specialists who had adapted commercial autonomous vehicle technology to a weapons application in an active war zone under extreme resource constraints. The lead platform engineer on the strike package had been developing agricultural automation systems before the full-scale invasion began. Within 18 months of the invasion, he was programming terminal attack geometries for naval drone operations in the Black Sea. Ukraine does not just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The tactical innovation embedded in this operation extended beyond the hardware. The use of decoys to manipulate escort behavior, the exploitation of a pre-mapped radar dead zone, the timing calibrated to the helicopter rotation gap. None of this was improvised. It was the product of months of deliberate planning, modeling, and rehearsal. The propulsion failure on Platform 7 was managed within the mission parameters because the operators had rehearsed exactly that scenario. They had asked the question, what if we lose a unit before engagement? They had built the answer into the operational plan. Will Russia manage to adequately protect its Shadow Fleet in the Black Sea against this kind of strike in the future? Comment why yes or no below. Your answer reveals which side you think has the doctrinal advantage. That kind of preparation, rehearsing failure modes before they happen, is a doctrine. It distinguishes a military organization that has learned from 3 years of intense combat from one still trying to apply 20th century operational frameworks to 21st century warfare. The Russian escort crews that night made reasonable decisions based on the information available to them. They were outplanned, not outfought. The engagement was decided before the first vessel crossed the demarcation line. Real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine radar. The aftermath extended into domains beyond the naval and financial. The sinking of a third country-flagged vessel in international waters raised immediate questions in maritime law circles about the status of Shadow Fleet tankers under international shipping conventions. Were they legitimate commercial vessels entitled to protection under international maritime law? Or were they instruments of sanctions evasion whose operators had forfeited some of those protections? From a practical standpoint, the legal debate was largely academic. Ukraine is a state at war defending its territory against a declared invasion. Its military operations in the Black Sea, including strikes on vessels supplying revenue to the aggressor, operate under the laws of armed conflict rather than peacetime maritime law. The Shadow Fleet tanker, regardless of its flag of convenience, was contributing materially to the Russian war effort. Under Ukrainian military doctrine and the legal advice of Ukraine's military lawyers, that made it a legitimate military objective, the crew's survival. All 23 merchant mariners recovered alive. was both a fortunate outcome and a deliberate operational consideration. Ukrainian naval drone doctrine, as reflected in the public statements of Ukrainian defense officials, explicitly incorporates the goal of crew preservation where possible. The timing and sequencing of the strikes, which concentrated initial impacts on the engine room and cargo sections rather than crew quarters, reflected that consideration. The merchant mariners were civilians who had taken employment on a vessel that turned out to be something other than what it claimed to be. Their survival does not change the legality of the operation. But it matters. It matters for the record. It matters for the story of how Ukraine fights this war. Now, the moment you have been waiting for. The answer to the quiz question. How many vessels successfully reached the tanker? The answer is C7. All 7 non-decoy strike platforms reached the engagement zone and attempted attack runs. 6 successfully detonated against the target. 1 was destroyed by the tanker's deck gun at 200 meters. Close enough that the detonation still contributed to the overall damage picture. This is why the strike package planning called for 7 vessels against a single target rather than 4 or 5. The planners modeled defensive fire probability and built redundancy into the attack geometry. The math worked. Was the decision to split the decoy package 4-8 the optimal ratio? Given that the escort drew off completely and the tanker was reached by all strike elements, a smaller decoy package might have achieved the same result with fewer sacrificed platforms. The counter-argument is that a smaller decoy showing might not have convinced the escort commanders to fully commit. The larger question is whether a partial escort commitment, 1 patrol boat chasing decoys, 1 remaining on station, would have changed the outcome. Probably not, given the speed of the terminal attack phase. But the planning team chose the more conservative ratio, and the operation succeeded. Conservative in planning, aggressive in execution. That is the Ukrainian approach. What the Black Sea has become in this war is a laboratory. Both sides have been forced to adapt to conditions that no naval doctrine anticipated. Russia lost its flagship surface combatant to Neptune anti-ship missiles. It lost patrol craft to naval drones. It lost the ability to operate its fleet in the western Black Sea without constant threat. And now it has learned that even in the eastern Black Sea, even beyond the range of most Ukrainian shore-based systems, even with escort coverage and radar surveillance, a shadow fleet vessel is not safe. Ukraine, operating without a conventional naval surface fleet, has developed asymmetric naval strike capability that has achieved strategic effects out of proportion to the cost invested. The ratio of damage inflicted to investment in this single operation, 40-1 by conservative financial estimates, represents a form of economic leverage that sanctions lawyers and Treasury Department analysts had not anticipated when they designed the price cap mechanism. The mechanism was designed to reduce Russian oil revenues through market pressure. Ukraine has added kinetic enforcement to that mechanism. The combined effect is compressive. 3 questions before we close. Was the decision to sacrifice 4 decoy platforms the right tactical choice? The mission succeeded. But those 4 platforms represented significant cost and operational capacity. A more targeted deception, perhaps using electronic jamming to simulate the radar signature of a drone swarm rather than physical decoys, might have achieved the same escort diversion at lower material cost. The counter-argument is that physical platforms moving at 32 knots are far more convincing to a patrol boat crew at 3 in the morning than a jamming return. What would you have done? Could Russia have prevented this outcome with different escort doctrine? The escort team made reasonable decisions in real time. But the underlying vulnerability was not escort composition. It was the predictability of the tanker's operational patterns and the pre-mappable gaps in the coastal radar coverage. A more unpredictable routing schedule, combined with more robust low-altitude helicopter coverage without fixed rotation gaps, would have significantly complicated Ukrainian planning. Russia's escort doctrine was designed for a threat environment that existed before Ukrainian naval drone technology matured. It was not updated fast enough. What would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian strike operations commander? The operation succeeded comprehensively. But the propulsion fault on Platform 7 was a reminder that mechanical reliability at sea is never guaranteed. Would you have staged a larger reserve? Would you have changed the sequencing to allow more time between impacts and let the vessel begin flooding more slowly, potentially trapping more enemy defensive attention on damage control rather than drone interception? These are the questions that real military planners argue over after every operation. They are the questions that make the next operation better than the last. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Black Sea is quieter now than it was before that night. The shadow fleet is thinner, slower, more cautious. Tanker captains know something they did not know before. that the reach of Ukrainian naval strike operations extends further than official doctrine suggests, that escort coverage has gaps, and that the calculus of profit versus risk has changed. The wreck sits on the bottom in international waters. The crude oil that did not burn is slowly dispersing. The distress beacon has long since gone silent, but the strategic effect continues. In altered shipping routes, in higher insurance premiums for vessels flagged through shadow networks, in the additional patrol assets Russia has deployed at cost to its own naval readiness. Silent wrecks, loud consequences. That is Ukraine radar.